I am making a video game where the basic premise is that you have a fixed amount of power-ups per level, but the catch is that you can only switch your power-ups after you die. And this is part 2 of my devlog series. So in the last video, I just showed the most basic example of something playable, but I didn't really explain anything besides the premise. So in this video, I'm hoping to explain the basics of the game, the basics of the few mechanics that I have, and pretty much everything else that will come in the future will be just an extension of those mechanics. So, well, first of all, we have to start with the movement. So in the last video, I showed a character that was 2 blocks high and 1 block wide. And here, this character is way smaller. And the actual hitbox is, well, its height is the same as 1 block, but its width is way smaller. And the reason for this change is because making the sprite bigger would require me to change the proportions of the sprite, and that would kind of ruin the whole sprite itself, so I don't want to do that. And second of all, I think the character being way smaller, the size of 1 block, is actually kind of better, because the way the movement is right now is that the character feels very heavy, and I just like a small character that feels heavy. So if we're talking about movement, I've also added some things that are called grace periods for jumping. Yeah, for jumping. So for example, after you fall off the ledge, for a couple of seconds while you're still in the air, you're still able to jump. And this is a common thing in games. For example, Celeste, I think, has a grace period of 6 frames for which you can jump after being in the air. So this is kind of just a cheat for players. I also added the same thing for pressing jumps. So basically, you can't really hold jump. You have to like press jump each time you're jumping. But what I've done is, if you press jump a couple frames before touching the ground, you'll still automatically jump after touching the ground. So that's also a player cheat. I've also considered adding a thing where, well, if you touch the spikes, you die, right? But what I've considered adding is just some sort of a grace period for spikes as well. So for example, if you're in the spikes for like 0.2 seconds, but the grace period is 0.3 seconds, then you'll just survive. Basically, these are just a couple of things I added or considered adding to the player just to make the whole controls feel way better and just responsive and shit. Oh, and also another minor thing, if you're going fast and you fall, then your movement slows down. So like this. It's barely noticeable, but the thing is still pretty cool. So yeah, that's the player. And now for the power-ups. So basically right now we just have 3 power-ups. So the dash, the invert gravity, and the double jump. And how they work is that you can use them once and then you have to touch the ground before using them again. Keep that in mind because this is going to be important for the end of the video. And the way the power-ups are implemented right now is that the player is aware that he can dash and he can invert his gravity. The power-ups don't really have any control of the player. They just have a certain condition that has to be met, and when that condition is met, then they just call a function on the player to just dash or invert gravity. And the player has all the logic for that. And so also for the dash, for example, you can, after you dash, your gravity is decreased for a short amount of time. If the gravity wasn't decreased, then you just like fall straight to the ground. Calling them power-ups, they're supposed to be abilities. I'm fucking retarded. The problem is that if I add more abilities, the player will have to contain all the logic for all the abilities. So for example, if I have an ability that doesn't kill the player after he dies. So for example, I had an idea for an ability that after you die, you're able to wander around like as a ghost or some shit, and you can go through walls, but only for like a second or 2 seconds. The player will have to contain logic, and when the player dies, then it will instead have to check if he has this specific power-up, and if he has this specific power-up, then just wander around for a bit. And if I have more other power-ups that interact with death in various ways, then the player will have to contain all this logic, and that's just not sustainable. I will have fixes for this and I'll explain them when the time comes, but this is just a thing I considered when making all the logic for the player. Hi, this is future me, and some of you might have realized this potential bug, but if you can jump a couple frames after leaving the ground, then you can technically jump right after inverting your gravity. And indeed you can, but it's barely noticeable and it's not really useful. But it's kind of wild. Of course, it's not difficult to fix, but it's kind of interesting to see how these kinds of bugs come around. Anyway, another thing I want to explain a little bit better is these keys, as I called in the last video. But currently I'm naming them trigger sources and trigger destinations. So here this square is a trigger source, and the trigger destination is the wall. The condition for triggering this trigger source is just for the player to be in its location. And after it gets triggered, it tells the trigger destination that something got triggered and for the trigger destination to apply its logic, and then it just disables itself. And the trigger destination's logic is also just to disable itself. This might seem overly complicated, but the thing is that there could be various types of trigger sources and various types of trigger destinations. And here's another example for a trigger source and a trigger destination. So this is supposed to be a lever. I just draw it really quickly. It's not a thing that I intend to keep in the game. But if I walk over the lever, nothing happens. So the condition for triggering this trigger source is to press that action button, which is X right now, but it might be changed. So if I press it, then the trigger destination gets triggered. And what it does is move a block in a certain direction. So right now the movement is instantaneous, but it wouldn't be difficult to make it more smooth. And I implemented checkpoints in pretty much the same way. So you just have to be within the square of the checkpoint and you press X and you trigger a checkpoint trigger destination. That's what I'm calling it. And the checkpoint trigger destination just has a checkpoint and it tells the level manager to activate that checkpoint. And if you select another checkpoint, then it changes the checkpoint. And here you can see that I'm spawning from that one, and if I go here, and it also keeps your gravity. And I'm hoping in the future to keep more than gravity. I'm still not sure what I'll keep within the checkpoint, but it's an option. And also the actual starting point of the level is also a checkpoint. It's just a checkpoint that doesn't have a trigger source, it doesn't have a trigger destination, so it cannot be activated and it's not visible, obviously. But I'll probably make it visible, just not activatable. I'm also considering adding just different checkpoints. So for example, ability that allows you to place checkpoints. I'm not sure how puzzly that could be, but it's just an option. And these are pretty much the basics of the game, and every other mechanic will just probably extend for those basics. In the next video, I'm hoping to add way more abilities and also explain how I'm hoping to visualize abilities, because right now I just have a color tint, which is looking ugly as shit, and I'm really not gonna keep that. But yeah, the next video will be just making a couple of puzzly levels and focusing on the graphics of the power-up. Fucking abilities, not power-ups. For the end of this video, I want to show you a level that uses checkpoints in an interesting way. So currently I can just use any power-up as much as I want, but let's just pretend, just make pretend with me, that I can use the invert gravity power-up once and the dash power-up once. And you can only switch your power-ups when you die. And I need to find a way to beat this level. Okay, think about it for a bit. Okay, you got it? So basically what you do is you invert your gravity and then you invert your gravity again and only then activate the power up. And after that you can spawn with your dash and you'll win if you dash at the right time. Oh shit. There's some problem with the character direction, but yeah, that's how you do it. But yeah, thanks for watching and see you in the next video where I'll hopefully have something that looks actually interesting. Like, subscribe, all that stuff, and have a nice day. Seriously, I still don't have any better names than just Die to Live.